Well, thank you to AFSP for organizing this symposium. It's very important information that we're going to be sharing, and I also want to thank our first speaker, Mike, for sharing that incredibly personal story. I think it's very important to hear those kinds of stories, and so I wanted to thank him as well for doing that. I also want to thank AFSP in general because they actually provided me the first grant that I ever received in my research career, which it was a young investigator grant. They sort of took a risk on a new assistant professor, fairly new out of grad school, who wanted to do some longitudinal research on the predictors and course of development of LGBT youth. We've had very little research in this area, and I put in a proposal to study the longitudinal predictors of making suicide attempts in LGBT youth, and they granted me that award. As I said, it was the first grant I ever received, and it really launched what has become what is now the longest running longitudinal study of LGBT youth ever conducted, and have gone on to get $13 million in other research funding. So I think it just speaks to the real benefit that these AFSP grants provide in helping people launch their career and get research projects started that can go on to bigger and larger projects down the road. So I want to thank AFSP for helping me start my career in that way. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of my own research and some more general research on suicide risk in LGBT youth and the prevention of suicide in LGBT youth. I just want to begin by briefly mentioning something about the IMPACT program, which is the program at Northwestern University that I direct, focused on LGBT health and development. And IMPACT aims to be a center at Northwestern that conducts translational research that improves the health of sexual minority or LGBT people, and to increase understanding of the development of sexual orientation and gender identity. We have a number of faculty at IMPACT who are doing work in this area. And our website, impactprogram.org, is a resource for information about LGBT health, specifically information targeted at LGBT youth. So we put a lot of the science that we're creating, we try to write it in ways that young people can understand, their parents can understand and benefit from, and put it up on our website. So I invite you to go to our website at some point and make use of some of the resources that we provided on the website. Another one of our missions is really to train the next generation of scholars and clinicians who are going to be doing work focused on LGBT health, and some of our trainees are in the room today, and we're very happy to be able to help support the next generation that's going to be making the scientific advancements in this area. So today I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the research that's been conducted on suicide amongst LGB youth. You're going to see me using the acronym LGB and sometimes LGBT, standing for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. I use the LGB or LGBT acronym precisely, depending on whether the study that I'm talking about does include trans populations or not. I'm going to share some data, some very sort of hot off the press data from a number of recent projects that we recently completed. Talk a little bit about what we don't know about suicide risk in LGBT youth, and then say a few things about what I think are some priority areas for future research in this area. So overall, suicide completion is the third leading cause of death amongst adolescents and young adults in the United States, ages 15 to 24. Suicide is second only to accidental death and homicide in the United States amongst young people. So it's a significant public health problem in the United States. But on top of that, while we know it's something we need to address amongst all youth, it's particularly an issue among some specific subpopulations that are at increased risk. And LGBT youth are one of those populations that's at increased risk. So let me just start by defining some terms, and most of you are probably familiar with this, but what do we mean by LGB? What does lesbian, gay, bisexual mean? Well, a person's sexual orientation, everybody has a sexual orientation, whether that's a heterosexual or gay or lesbian or bisexual orientation. Everybody has a sexual orientation, and it can range from being primarily heterosexual to primarily same-sex attracted or primarily having same-sex partners. And the components of sexual orientation include things like sexual attractions, romantic attractions, sexual fantasies, who you're attracted to, your behavior, and your self-identification, the labels that you use. But amongst adolescents, these don't overlap perfectly. So an adolescent may report same-sex attractions, but they may not yet have had sexual contact at all. So they may not have had same-sex behavior yet. So it's important when you're studying sexual orientation in youth to really understand that there's different components of sexual orientation, and they may be differentially related to the outcomes that you're interested in studying. What does transgender mean, or who are transgender youth? Transgender is an umbrella term that includes persons whose gender identity, expression, or behavior does not conform to societal gender norms associated with their sex as assigned at birth. They may or may not have made physical changes to their body to match their gender identity. And the prevalence is largely unknown. We don't have population-based studies of the number of transgender people in the United States. So what do we know about suicide in LGB youth? We have a number of convenience studies. These are samples of not using necessarily a population-based approach. They have consistently shown that LGBT youth have somewhere between 2 and 5 times the rate of making suicide attempts as their heterosexual peers. I'm going to show some numbers from school-based samples. School-based samples have the benefit that they are more representative of the population of youth in the United States who are in school, which is the majority of youth. And this is a summary of 20 studies of suicide in school-based samples of youth in the United States. And this is the rate of suicidality. Now, suicidality is a very broad term that encompasses having thoughts of suicide, making a plan or having an intention to make a suicide attempt, making an attempt, and making an attempt with an injury. So this is a very, very broad definition of suicidality. But what you can see is that if you compare the rate amongst males, 17% of heterosexual males, adolescents in these school-based samples, report one of these dimensions of suicidality, whereas 28% of the gay and bisexual males report one of these dimensions. In females, the numbers are 23 and 37%. And overall, the number, if you combine the males and females, it's about twice as high in the LGBT youth as it is in the heterosexual youth. In fact, the odds ratio of making one of the, or having one of these dimensions of suicidality is nearly 3 times higher amongst the LGBT youth. And what we find is when you actually start getting a little more precise about which population of LGBT you're talking about, we see that this effect is largest amongst the bisexual youth. The bisexual youth, as compared to the heterosexual youth, have about 5 times the rate of one of these dimensions of suicidality, whereas the gay and lesbian youth have slightly less than 2 times the odds of one of these dimensions of suicide. So bisexual youth may be a group that are at particular risk for one of these dimensions of suicidality. And unfortunately, they're the population that we probably studied the least in terms of what are their unique risk and protective factors. Interestingly, when you continue to unpack these relationships and look at them more, in more fine-grained detail, obviously that suicidality measure is quite broad. When you start looking at specific aspects of suicidality, we find that the effect actually gets larger the more intense, whoops, why is this? The more intense the aspect of suicidality is that we're addressing. So if you look at ideation, the LGBT youth have about a 2-fold increase. When you get into ideation, making a plan, it becomes a 2.2-fold. Making a suicide attempt, 3-fold. Actually, an attempt that results in injury or medical attention, a 4-fold increase. So the more intense the aspect of the suicide risk is, the larger the difference is between the lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth and their heterosexual peers. And there's also a larger effect for more recent attempts than lifetime attempts, a 3-fold increase. And again, this is data from that large-scale combination of 20 studies in the area. We also have had 3 studies that have actually looked at completed suicides. And these are what we call psychological autopsy studies, where somebody dies by suicide and people go and investigate. They interview the family and friends and try to understand the sexual orientation of that person. They try to understand what might have been the risk factors in that person's life that precipitated the suicide. And basically in all 3 of these studies, the takeaway point is that they find no differences in sexual orientation, that they don't find more LGBT people dying by suicide than they do heterosexual people. So that really presents the question, why are we finding consistently in study after study that LGBT youth are making more suicide attempts, but we have no evidence that they're actually more likely to die by suicide? And that could be a number of reasons why these differences exist. It could reflect a true difference in lethal suicide attempts. So it's possible that LGBT youth are more likely to make attempts, but they're not making lethal attempts. And so they're not more likely to die by suicide, but they're making non-lethal suicide attempts. It could reflect some limitations of the psychological autopsy approach. You can imagine when someone dies by suicide, somebody coming and interviewing the family and trying to understand that person's sexual orientation. The parents may be reticent to disclose information. The parents may not know what their child's sexual orientation was. So there's a lot of limitations of this psychological autopsy approach. It could also reflect a tendency to over-report suicide attempts amongst LGBT youth or under-report amongst heterosexual youth. So there could be some differences in how these populations are maybe more likely to disclose an attempt when it happens. These are all things that we need to understand more about. We know very little. We've had very few studies of suicidality in transgender samples. There's really only 2 amongst youth that have been reported. One by Grossman and Diagelli in 2007 that studied 55 transgender youth, and nearly half of them had reported a serious suicide attempt, and serious suicidal ideation, and 1/4 reported a suicide attempt. In our own study of LGBT youth, we found that the transgender youth reported similar levels of suicidal ideation, but slight elevation in lifetime attempts amongst the transgender sample compared to the LGBT youth. So what are the factors that are driving risk for suicide amongst LGBT youth? One of the things that I think is important to do is to sort of step back and say, what are the factors that drive suicide attempts amongst all youth? LGBT youth share a lot of similarities with their heterosexual peers, and it's not like every aspect of their life is distinct and unique. In many ways, they're just like every other young person, and so we want to also understand to what extent the risk factors that impact heterosexual youth also impact gay and lesbian youth. And the risk factors in the general adolescent literature include mental and addictive disorders. We believe about 90% of suicide attempts occur deaths by suicide occur in people who have a mental or addiction disorder. Impulsivity is a risk factor. Hopelessness, feeling that you have no future, that things are not looking good for you in the future. And actually early puberty is a risk factor for suicide as well. Now, when we start thinking about LGBT-specific risk, we know that actually 3 of these general factors are things that LGBT youth are actually at increased risk for as well. LGBT youth are at greater risk for mental and substance use disorders compared to their heterosexual peers. Some studies have shown higher levels of hopelessness, and there are also data showing they undergo puberty earlier than their heterosexual peers. So there's some biological factors perhaps that may be relevant. So they're at risk for these risk factors as well. But there also are some LGBT-specific risk factors that we also need to pay attention to. And actually, this is where the majority of research has occurred so far, has really been focusing on these LGBT-specific factors. There hasn't been much attention to the extent to which these more general factors are relevant for heterosexual youth. Now, I'm listing 5 factors here that are relevant, that are LGBT-specific factors. Some studies have linked an earlier age of coming out with more likelihood of making a suicide attempt. Also, there's some evidence that being more out is a risk factor. Now, part of the problem is that many of these studies were conducted in the mid-90s, in the 80s. We don't know if that's the same today, where social acceptance of being a gay youth has changed so dramatically, changes dramatically almost every year at this point. And so we really need current studies that are investigating how things look in this era of social change. And in fact, some studies have found the opposite effect, that being out is actually a protective factor. And I would probably posit that coming out is a very difficult process. And during that process of coming out, youth may be at more risk for making a suicide attempt. But once they've integrated their identity and they've come through the coming out process, then they've resolved it, that being out is no longer a risk factor. And so depending on where you sample people in that coming out process, you may or may not find effects. Increasingly, youth are coming out at younger ages as well, which is another reason why we need more research with LGBT youth, so we can understand, again, and concurrently, in our current social context, how the coming out process is relevant. And there's really been actually very little research on protective factors like family support and parental support, and how those impact suicide risk in LGBT youth. There's also been just very recently, we've started to understand how social policies and social factors impact suicide risk in LGBT youth. You know, we're living in this era of social change where some states are passing anti-gay legislation, other states are passing marriage equality legislation, and a colleague of mine, Mark Hatzenbuehler, has really been doing some fascinating research studying the impacts of these social policies on LGBT youth. And he just published a paper in Pediatrics that actually showed in Oregon, he looked at counties and different policies in different counties related to, for example, the proportion of same-sex couples, if they have gay-straight alliances in their schools, if schools have non-discrimination policies. And he found that the risk for suicide was 20% greater in those counties that did not have supportive policies for LGBT youth. 20% increase in suicide attempts. So these policies related to non-discrimination, to creating GSAs, are a structural factor that can make a big impact on suicide amongst LGBT youth. So what don't we know? Well, unfortunately, most studies don't do a great job of measuring a person's LGBT status. As I mentioned before, there's multiple dimensions of sexual orientation, and most studies usually look at one. Do you identify as gay, or did you have sex with someone of the same sex? That don't really get at the nuances of the spectrum of sexual orientation. Many studies also ask only one question about suicide. In most of our large population or school-based samples, they ask, did you make a suicide attempt? They don't look at ideation, they don't look at plan, and they don't really necessarily look at whether it was a suicide attempt that resulted in medical attention or what was the means of attempt. So we really need to delve into that in more detail. We know very little about subpopulations of LGBT youth. We know very little about youth of color. We know very little about female youth. There's some inconsistent results in young LGBT women. We tend to look at one variable at a time instead of looking at a comprehensive picture. And we look, you know, one of, I think, the deficits of our field is we look all at risk factors. What puts people at risk? We don't look at what makes people do well, what's promotive, what's protective. We need to do more of that. And there's almost no longitudinal data, so almost all of what we're relying on are cross-sectional associations, which really don't take into account the developmental context. They don't allow us to really understand what predicts suicide attempts. You need longitudinal data for that. So I'm going to share with you one study that we did with support from AFSP that was a longitudinal study and sought to identify the longitudinal predictors, both general and LGBT-specific predictors of suicide attempts in a cohort of LGBT youth. This data comes from Project Q2. As I mentioned, it's the longest running longitudinal study of LGBT youth ever conducted. We're happy to report that just several weeks ago we completed our 8th wave of follow-up data collection in the sample, with 83% of the sample has been with us for 4 years, this cohort of LGBT youth. So we're very excited and very happy that the youth are continuing to participate in this important project. The sample is very diverse. It's 49% female, 43% male, 8% transgender identity, and 86% of the sample is racial ethnic minorities. A number of people have funded us over the years for Project Q2, including AFSP, which gave us our inaugural grant to get the project started. The results that I'm going to be presenting here come from 2 papers, one published in Archives of Sexual Behavior in 2013, I believe, and one published in American Journal of Preventive Medicine in 2012, both of them looking at the longitudinal data that I'm going to be describing here. We looked, just to briefly let you know how we measured things, we looked at suicide in the context of a structured psychiatric interview, so it was a very rigorous approach to measuring mental health and measuring a suicide attempt. We asked survey questions about hopelessness and impulsivity. We asked survey questions about social support from parents and peers. And we asked survey questions about childhood gender nonconformity, age of first same-sex attraction, and experiences of victimization. Here's what we found. In our sample, 32% of the youth had made a suicide attempt at some point in their life. Nearly a third of the sample had made a suicide attempt. A little over 7% had made a suicide attempt in the last year. And when we followed them over a year, during that 1-year follow-up period, 5.5% of them made a suicide attempt during that 1-year follow-up. Now, these are data for the whole sample. If you break it down more specifically, we find that in the lifetime, about a quarter of the boys made a suicide attempt, about a third of the girls, and half of the trans youth had made a suicide attempt in their lifetime. Trans youth, in terms of the predictors, the risk factors, 14% met criteria for major depressive disorder, 27% had minimal support of their family, and 88% had experienced some form of victimization, like people spitting on them, destroying their property, teasing them, harassing them because of their sexual orientation. And the average age of first same-sex attraction was 11, which is consistent with what you find with heterosexual youth. Around the time of puberty, kids start having sexual attractions. It's the same for gay youth as it is for straight youth. Trans youth reported more of these risk factors than their LGBT peers. They were more likely to have hopelessness, experience victimization. All of these factors were significantly correlated with a suicide attempt. So what we did next is we put them all into one analysis at the same time. So these are all related to making a suicide attempt. What are the most important predictors amongst this large group of predictors that we had? And so this is the result of it. Wonderful table that scientists love to use to present our results. But the two things that I would point you to, there's just two numbers that are really important here. We looked at all of these risk factors. And the first one is major depressive symptoms. That 1.17 under the odds ratio shows that each symptom of depression increased the odds of making a suicide attempt by 17%. The more symptoms of depression you had, the more likely you were to make a suicide attempt. The other important one is hopelessness, 2.69, 2.7. Each symptom of hopelessness led to more than a 2.5-fold increase in a suicide attempt. Those are the most important risk factors in our model of all of the risk factors that had been found to be significantly associated. And what that tells us is actually that while all of these factors are important, most of their influence goes through hopelessness and depression. And we know how to address hopelessness and depression. And I think that's good news for us because it tells us that if we can get young people who are experiencing hopelessness and depression into treatment, into mental health care, that we can help reduce their risk of making a suicide attempt. Now, when we followed them longitudinally and we looked at this same effect longitudinally, the biggest predictor that we found was them making a suicide attempt at baseline. So those youth who had made a suicide attempt when they first started the study were 10.5 times more likely to make a suicide attempt 1 year earlier. So again, that tells us the biggest predictor of making a future suicide attempt is having made an attempt in the past. And I think that's very important for clinicians and public health professionals to understand that we have to take suicide attempts seriously. If a youth makes a suicide attempt, they need to be given access to care and resources, that they should not just be ignored. Ignoring it won't make it go away. It has to be addressed. During the 1-year follow-up period, 13 youth reported a suicide attempt, including 10 participants who had made a suicide attempt at the time of enrollment. Of the 75 youth who had a lifetime history of suicide attempt at baseline, 13% of them made another attempt during the 1-year follow-up period. So this is a lot about risk factors. Depression is a risk factor. Hopelessness is a risk factor. What kind of influences do we think will have a protective effect? Well, one of the things that we've been studying for many years now is family relationships and family support. And what I can tell you is across a whole number of outcomes, HIV/AIDS, depression, suicide, substance use, the list goes on, having a supportive family context and family relationships is protective against youth for all of these outcomes. And so this is just some data. It's a lot of data. I'm happy to send the actual article to anyone who's interested. But it's just what percentage of the youth reported that they were out to their mother and that their mother was accepting. So you can see 78% 77.8% were out to their mother, and half of mothers reported that they were accepting. The child reported, my mother was accepting when I told her about my sexual orientation. We find that heterosexual friends are the most likely to be accepting, aware and accepting. The mothers and sisters are next, followed by fathers and brothers. So fathers and brothers need to do a little work to catch up to the mothers and sisters. But fortunately, only 2.5% of the youth in our sample reported that no one was aware of their sexual orientation or was accepting of their sexual orientation. So youth have someone in the constellation of their social and family network that they're out to in most cases that can be a resource to them. And we need to tap into those resources. In analyses looking at family support and victimization, we found that family support was protective, was promotive. Kids who had supportive families were less likely to be depressed. They were less likely to make a suicide attempt. But it didn't eliminate the effect of bullying and victimization. So they're independent effects. Social support helps kids, victimization hurts kids, but you can't support away the victimization. We have to address bullying directly in schools and communities. You can't just support away its effects. So what are some priority areas for reducing suicide risk amongst LGBT youth? As I said, we have to reduce victimization in schools and in communities and in neighborhoods and in families. GLSEN is an excellent resource for more information. We need to increase social support for LGBT youth. LGBT youth centers, we have several in Chicago that provide social and health and social support and resources for LGBT youth are really a critical avenue for youth. Online resources like the Impact Program, and Trevor Space has an excellent website for LGBT youth, the Trevor Line. Gay-straight alliances and improving family relationships are critical. We need to support healthy romantic relationships. You know, if you talk to a 14-year-old, what do they spend their time thinking about? Who am I going to date? You know, does he like me? Is he going to return my phone call? Is he going to return my text? Those are the obsessions of adolescence, and that's because romantic relationships are a big part of adolescent development. We need to create opportunities for healthy same-sex adolescent relationships. And we need to improve social acceptance and supportive social policies because the research clearly shows that they're important. So let me just end by making what I think is a really critical, important point, and I try to make this every time I speak to the media or do an interview with a journalist. You know, I've talked a lot about suicide risk in LGBT youth, that 1/3 of them made an attempt. But you know what I want to point out is 2/3 of them didn't make an attempt. Many of the LGBT youth are doing well. Most of them are doing well, and we have to remember that. It's easy to focus on what's not going well. And this is an example of a campaign the Impact Program led called I Heart My Sexuality. It's a video campaign and a multimedia campaign. We were at the Pride Festival several years ago, and we asked youth to just write on a card, what do you like about being gay? And we have hundreds of these cards on our website. You can just scroll through them, and they're really lovely to read. 3 of them here, 5 years openly gay, the best 5 years of my life. Coming out was so freeing, and I'm so happy to be a lesbian. I like being gay because I have a beautiful girlfriend, and I love her. So, you know, I think it's just important to end on the positives and remember the strength of our community. I want to thank our funders. We've been blessed to have many people fund our work, and we're so thankful to it because we wouldn't be able to do this work without the funding. So thanks to them and our project staff. For more information, you can email me at brian@northwestern.edu. You can go to the impactprogram.org website. My Twitter handle is @sexualcontinuum because I write a blog for Psychology Today magazine called the Sexual Continuum blog, where I write a lot about LGBT health. So you're also welcome to check out that blog on the Psychology Today website. Thank you for your attention, and I'm not sure how much time we have for questions, but.